Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatore. So what is the oldest martial art? Well, first of all, to answer that question we have to say, what is a martial art? Well, quite simply, it's a system for fighting. Martial comes from the god of war, Mars, the Roman god of war, so it means a warlike art. So the practice of fighting, essentially, a combat art. Some people might call it a science, some people will call it an art. We could have long discussions about what's the difference between science and art, but fundamentally it comes down to a fighting system. So, next up, how do you define different martial arts? Well, fundamentally, what is a martial art? If a martial art is a fighting system, wrestling, that's a martial art. Jujutsu, that's a specific type of system. Is Jujutsu different to wrestling? Well, it's a specific style of wrestling, isn't it? So, how we define different martial arts very much comes down to what level of difference we want to be specific about. Is Jiu-Jitsu different to catch wrestling? Well, it's definitely a different system of wrestling, but they're both types of wrestling. So to answer the question, which is the oldest martial art, you first of all have to all agree what a martial art is. I think most people would agree it's some type of combative art, combative system, but then you also have to agree at what level do we divide the different martial arts. Do we just say wrestling, all types of wrestling, that's one martial art, and then using a bow, for example, that's definitely a martial art. Archery is definitely a martial art. Throwing spears, javelin throwing, that's definitely a martial art. In fact, you could say pretty much anything that's intended to kill another human is a martial art. So indeed, using a rifle, that's a martial art. Now clearly using rifles, we can say that shooting with a rifle is not as old as using bows, and using bows is almost certainly not as old as using spears. So we can say that spear throwing is a very ancient martial art. But is Japanese spear throwing very different to ancient Roman spear throwing, pilum throwing? And is Roman pilum throwing very different to Neanderthal spear throwing? Well, they're all throwing a spear. They're fundamentally quite similar, aren't they? So you could say that spear throwing is a very ancient martial art, but then someone will say, Neanderthal spear throwing is definitely older than Roman spear throwing. But then I would say, that might be true, but there were other forms of human-like, people-like species around before Neanderthals, and so they were using spears as well. So that's even older, so the Neanderthals don't have the oldest, and but then someone might say, but the Neanderthals didn't just have one style of spear throwing. Maybe some Neanderthals just threw a spear simply, and some of them used a thong at the back to assist it, and maybe some of them used a woomerer, maybe some of them used a spear thrower. So are those different martial arts, or is spear throwing all one martial art? The point I'm trying to make is saying what is the oldest martial art is fraught with difficulty and is rather silly. If, let's say, Kalaripayattu says, we are the oldest martial art, well, really? How are you defining yourself as a martial art? Is there a continuous tradition? Is what you are doing now the same as what you were doing 10 years ago? Is it the same as what you were doing 100 years ago? Is it the same as what you were doing 1,000 years ago? We don't know, because as far as I know there's no Kalaripayattu books out there for us to cross-reference and go, yep, you're doing that technique exactly the same way as you were doing it 100 years ago or 500 years ago. So is the Kalaripayattu is just having the name Kalaripayattu? Is that enough to say that modern Kalaripayattu is exactly the same as Kalaripayattu was 1,000 years ago? I don't think so, unless you've got documentary evidence to be able to demonstrate that, or even just a convincing oral tradition to say that yes, there has been a continuous lineage and minimal change. Even if we look at Japanese martial arts, which are transmitted in a very formal and systematic way, modern Jiu-Jitsu, the Jiu-Jitsu that's practiced now, right now, out in lots of clubs right at this moment, is in some ways quite different to Jiu-Jitsu as it was practiced 100 years ago, and itself, Jiu-Jitsu didn't really exist in its same form as it did 100 years ago say 500 years ago, because of course back then martial arts were part of one, a samurai training in the 16th century would learn some unarmed fighting, some striking, would learn fighting with knives, swords, spears, in armour, out of armour, on horseback, on foot, all of these different, much like the medieval knightly traditions. So they didn't just learn, Jujutsu, or they didn't just learn Kenjutsu or Kendo, they learnt martial arts, they learnt to use all their weapons and use their bodies. So really, arguing about what's the oldest martial art, hitting someone in the head with a rock back in however many tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago is a sort of martial art. Someone learnt the best way to use a stick, or to use a rock, or to use a bow, or a sling, or whatever, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of years ago. Was that a martial art? Was it different in one place to another? Is throwing a wooden spear in Kenya 50,000 years ago different to throwing a wooden spear in Spain 50,000 years ago? It's a ridiculous point and a ridiculous thing to argue over. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.